Hey everyone, and welcome to the Balanced Bodies Blueprint. I am your host, Vinny Russo, along here with my co-host, as usual, Dr. Erin Stansfield.
Hello.
And our special guest today is going to be Brandon DaCruz.
What's going on, guys?
Yeah. So obviously with this podcast, we try to shift gears from all the conventional fitness narrative that you hear on most fitness podcasts, as our main emphasis is going to lie in preventative healthcare, adapting a holistic approach to nutrition, and challenging the traditional views that you normally hear with most fitness topics. And our mission, once again, with this podcast is to serve as your beacon, guiding you on your journey towards achieving optimal health. So in today's podcast, we have the pleasure to welcome Brandon DaCruz to help you understand everything that you need to know about metabolic adaptation, which is a very big buzzword right now. So I just want to give Brandon just a brief introduction, and then I'll let him fill in any spots that I missed. So Brandon is an online nutrition and physique coach. He's a certified nutritionist. He's internationally published fitness model. And if you ever seen his photos, you'd understand why. And he is a national level NPC competitor. He's been featured in many publications, including like Men's Fitness Magazine, Muscular Development, Bodybuilding.com. And what I find to be really cool is he's a contributing author for Alan Aragon's research review. So that's pretty awesome, man. He spent the last 15 years working in the fitness industry, and he's worked with over 1,000 clients. And if you ever seen his content before, you will know that, you know, he believes in taking a very evidence-informed approach, and he blends that in with his experience. So Brandon, welcome to the Balanced Bodies Blueprint. And once again, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Absolutely, my man. First and foremost, I want to, say thank you to both of you guys for having me on the show. I do appreciate it. I know you guys, I don't know if you've had your first guest yet, but I might be one of the first. So I do find that to be an honor.
You're the first, man. You're the first.
Hey, man, I appreciate that more than you even know. And it's really cool that, Vinny, you and I have known each other, and we can get into this in a little bit, for quite some time. So we obviously come from a competitive background. We both were, living in New Jersey for a long period of time. And we both had similar paths within this industry, going from like the coaching as well as modeling, as well as competing. So we've kind of melded, all these different backgrounds and these different paths to a point in our lives where this is our full-time profession. You and I both had, full-time careers. I just recently, last summer, so the summer of 2022, I left a corporate sports nutrition industry position that I had. I was a national sales director, and I worked in that for 10 plus years within the supplement industry. So I went all in on my coaching the last year. But a little bit, just a little bit more background about myself for those who aren't familiar with me, or you guys are just, getting introduced to me. I've been, as Vinny hit on, I've been working in the nutrition and the fitness industry for going on 15 years at this point. And most of that time was spent in the sports nutrition industry, working for evidence-based brands like Nutribio Labs, as well as many other. And but for the past 10 years, another focus of mine has been doing online coaching. And so like I mentioned, as of the last year, I left my corporate position and went all in on my one-on-one coaching company. And then, really the vast majority of my time is spent working in the trenches with clients from honestly all different backgrounds. So oftentimes I'll get on a podcast and they'll tell me, what is like your niche demographic, or what's your like client avatar? And honestly, I couldn't tell you guys. I work with everyone ranging from, high-level business executives and lifestyle clients to fellow fitness coaches. A vast majority of my roster are other fitness professionals, whether that be online coaches, nutritionists, dietitians, that could be personal trainers or gym owners. And then I also work with, many physique pros, and have for quite a long time. And, I've worked with people as high as, the IFBB, like guys stepping on the Olympia level stage. But besides working with clients and mentees, I try to devote and we just spoke about this off air, but I try to devote like a good amount of time and a good chunk of my time and energy to educating others. So I participate in several educational seminars each year. I'm also very active on the podcast scene. I have a podcast of my own called the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. So this is something that I just really love. I really aim to bridge the gap between research and information and then practical application, because you can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you have no ability to apply it or to teach others how to apply those principles, those practices into their own lives, and really be able to help them substantiate or create better habits and behaviors, it's practically meaningless. So really my goal, or really my intention in everything that I do, is to be able to get and put out education and empower people with information, but also teach them steps as to how to either understand that better or how to apply it into their own lives.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think you bring up a good point too, because it's like, if you ever notice, like professional athletes, sometimes they're not the best coaches. Like they have the knowledge, they know what to do, but they don't know how to teach it. And with us, we've been in the fitness industry for a very long time, doing the competitions and the fitness modeling. And we're able to at least explain it enough, and make it basically apply to all of our clients, and they're able to put that in to practice. And I think it takes a very skilled individual to be able to do so. I have some practice with that because I was a teacher and I left that and to become full-time balanced bodies head nutrition coach. So yeah, we have a very similar path. You're just way more well known than I am, man. Especially with all the podcasts you've been on, dude. And you started that Chasing Clarity. You were at Jeff Black, right?
Yeah, so I had done at this point, last spring, Jeff and I came together. I had been a guest speaker on his podcast many of times. He used to run a podcast called The Excellence Cartel, which
Excellent
you've been on
cartel, yeah.
yourself. And
Yeah.
so it was a tremendous podcast. They had hundreds of episodes and it was really successful. And I had not only been a guest, speaker on their podcast, but also I'd been given the pleasure and the honor of presenting many times in person with the Physique Education Collective, which was a seminar series that they did. I believe it was 8 or 9 iterations of it, essentially. So I spoke at 3 or 4 of them over the years. And so Jeff and I have, had a great relationship and great friendship over the last 4 years. So we really came together. Jeff is a great host. I'm kind of someone you just throw questions at and I'll run off information. I'm not great with the hosting abilities. I'll tell you, I just don't have that ability. So, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. So I can present information, but I'm not really good with like leading conversations and things. So we really balance each other out because Jeff is an incredibly inquisitive individual. He's
Yeah.
very into really like digging deep into things. And so we have a great combination. So at this point, man, I think I'm 200 plus podcasts deep, whether that be, also, guest appearances, but then also we're on today, we launched episode 83 or 84 of the podcast. So we're about a year and a half into our own. We do a weekly podcast every single week. And that's just something that I'm known for in terms
Yeah.
of consistency. I'm someone, I'll tell you personally, I made a vow in 2017. I was working with a lot of clients. I said, I will not miss one day of posting on social media. And I have yet to miss a day of posting. So this is hundreds or thousands at this point of posts that I've made on education in terms of my social media outlets, whether that
Can't
be
break the chain now,
Instagram.
man. You
No,
can't
I
break the
can't.
chain
No,
now.
and I almost feel like an obligation, but at the same time, it's something that pushes me forward. It's the same thing with clients. Like I'm not going to go to bed until my inbox is, essentially, functioned out. And so these are just like components of me as an individual that have spread out into my business. But another thing I wanted to hit on is it's not only the like our background, it's not only having the information and the application, but also the relatability to clients, because
Yeah.
a big component of coaching is the psychological side, getting to relate to people and telling them and being able to fully and transparently tell them and relate to them in the fact that you say, listen, I understand. I know what it's like to be hungry. I'll tell you personally, I've done 15 preps over the years. I've done over 100 professional photo shoots. There are many times that I've woken up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, had this adrenaline dump in the middle of the night, and I'm craving broccoli. Oddest thing in the world. However, I know that I don't have the calorie budget to fit that broccoli in. So I go right the hell to bed, or I go do steps, or I do something to distract my mindset. But it's something, there is something so tangible and important about being able to tell a client, listen, I will never ask you to do something that I would not,
Exactly.
be willing to do myself, or I have not done myself. So that's why I'm fortunate, and as you two are as well. I know Aaron has competed as well. So we all have this background, which is really unique because unfortunately, as all three of us know, our industry has become oversaturated, but it's not oversaturated with high quality coaches, educators, and individuals. It's people that just want in because they think they're going to kick back on a beach, sipping margaritas and answering
Yeah.
emails. And that's not what true coaching, quality coaching is about. It's about being able to really connect with clients, engage with them, create relationships and connections, and really be able to take these things that are challenges and obstacles and roadblocks in their way, where they've really held themselves back from being able to really overcome these obstacles, in previous phases when they didn't have a professional with them. But not only being able to tell them, listen, these are the principles we're going to use. This is how I'm going to set up your diet model. This is the training periodization we're going to utilize. However, it's also going to be, hey, I've been there. I know what
Yeah.
you're going through. I know what it's like to deal with hunger cravings, slipping off my diet and being hugely disappointed in myself and just wanting to say, what the F, and just like continue eating away, but I don't. And so it's something so unique about what we're doing currently within the space, because it's become so much more saturated. I mean, I got into coaching in 2013. The only individuals that I knew at that time that were coaching online, especially, were Jason Theobald, who's a great friend of mine. Dave Palumbo. There was a few guys in the Northeast. There was Shelby Starnes, like,
Yep.
and Lane Norton. And Lane was like, an idol to me at the time. I remember going and flying out in 2014 to see him speak in person. It was like, I can't believe this guy's making a full-time career out of this.
Yeah.
And never in my wildest dreams did I think that online coaching would be what it is today, but it's evolved so much more. It's not about macros. I always say nutrition or true coaching isn't about the X and O's of nutrition in terms of macros and calories, or these sets and reps in the gym. It's about someone's psychology, really being able to realize that psychology and physiology cannot be, they're interconnected, so they cannot be separated. We cannot discount one for the other. And so we're in a unique position where we can empower clients through education, we can relate to them and what they're going through, but then we can also take evidence-based principles and really inform their practices to better, essentially better the trajectory of their journey.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an awesome lead. You said you're not a host, but that's an awesome lead into what we're actually trying to do today. We're trying to give out this information. We're going to touch on your physiology, and we're going to touch on how that can affect your progress in terms of fat loss, body recomposition, things like that. And it really deals with the metabolism. So let's dive right into it. Why don't we just start off and give people an understanding of what metabolism actually is and what is it comprised of?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, oftentimes when we speak about metabolism, people are only looking at or only thinking about a calorie expenditure number. They're thinking about calories in, calories out, what they're burning, what they're able to eat. But really, our metabolism refers to the sum of all chemical processes our body goes through to keep us alive and to function, and the energy we expend throughout these processes. So our metabolism essentially acts as a thermometer that works as a measure of various inputs and outputs from both our body as well as our environment, which then determine our calorie needs and our calorie expenditure. And it's an adaptive and reactive system, which is never static. So I like to explain it to clients as we're always in flux. You are never I often speak to clients about a maintenance calorie range. It isn't one specific number. It's not this static amount that you either hit that and it's bullseye or bust. It's this adaptive range that could really depend on your activity levels, your sleep, all these different factors that could heavily influence, whether it's 200 calories down or 200 calories up. And so it's important to realize that our metabolism is always changing and adapting based on different factors like the quantity and the quality of the foods we eat, the macronutrient composition of our diet. So are we going high protein or do we have low protein? Even just little nutritional factors like that can really throw things off. It could depend on how hard we train, how active we are on a daily basis, our stress levels, our sleep quantity, as well as our quality, and then many other factors. And I find that when most think about or even speak about their metabolism, they usually only consider the metabolic rate side of things, which is a component of our metabolism. But our metabolism is actually made up of 4 different components that together equal our total daily energy expenditure, which is just essentially the total amount of calories that we burn per day. Now, our total daily energy expenditure comes from both resting and non-resting energy expenditure components, meaning the calories we burn just to function at rest, as well as the calories we burn through any sort of physical activity and exercise we engage in. So first, we have our basal metabolic rate, which is what most people think of. So this is your BMR, which accounts for generally or roughly 50 to 60% of our total daily energy expenditure. And our basal metabolic rate refers to the amount of energy we burn at rest just to essentially keep the lights on. So this is just to stay alive and just to be able, it's basically the amount of calories that we were to burn if we were just laying in bed all day and not engaged in any activity. So how high or low our BMR is mostly determined by our body weight, our body mass, and our body composition. And it's most heavily impacted and influenced by our lean body mass, which includes not only the amount of muscle we have, so that's what a lot of people focus on, which is the most modifiable component of our BMR, but it's also, influenced by our internal organs. So if you were to increase your total body mass by adding muscle, your BMR would increase as your body would require more energy just to exist and to fuel normal physiological functions day to day. However, this also works in the opposite direction, which I want to hit on this because this is a big component of metabolic adaptation. So say, for instance, that you go into a weight loss phase and you lose both body weight as well as body fat during a diet. Well, your BMR is going to decrease naturally as a result of being a lighter individual and thus needing less energy to function at rest. Now, the next component of this 4-component model to total daily energy expenditure is our thermic effect of food, which is also referred to as diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is essentially the energy our body burns through thermogenesis or heat to digest, assimilate, and metabolize the food we eat. Because in order to we essentially have to turn food into energy. Like there's a biochemical process. And so we need to invest energy into the process of digestion to get energy out of the nutrients we consume. So generally, when we look at research studies, this accounts for approximately 10% of our total daily energy expenditure. And that's really based on the macronutrient split of our diet, as each macro has a different thermic effect of feeding. So this is where we can really be a little bit more nuanced with nutrition, especially as nutrition coaches, because if we're able to bias a little bit more thermogenic foods, for instance, or macronutrients, we can potentially increase that thermic effect of feeding on a daily basis. So for instance, protein has the highest thermic effect of food at 20 to 30%. Whereas, so essentially, like for every 100 calories that you eat of protein, we only net out between 70 to 80 calories. Whereas if we look at carbs and fats, they have much, significantly lower thermic effects of feeding. So with carbs, we have about a 5 to 10% thermic effect of feeding. And with fats, we have about a 0 to 3% thermic effect of feeding. Now, the next component of our total daily energy expenditure is the one, honestly, that is most overlooked. And you guys, Vinny, I know you're very familiar with the stuff I've put out. I'm really very focused on this one because it's often the most neglected one. So this is going to be neat. So this is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And this is going to include all, informal activities. So this includes your activities of daily living, like your occupational activities, fidgeting and twitching, maintaining your posture. Even what I'm doing right now, like I'm speaking with my hands like this. I'm Italian, so I'm from Jersey too. So I'm always moving, and I'm my needs through the roof right now. And so this also includes your daily steps and pretty much everything we do physically, besides the intentional training and formal training sessions that you do in the gym. Now, here's the thing with NEAT. It's the most variable component between individuals and also the most modifiable component of our energy expenditure. And generally, it's an account for between 15 to 25% of our total daily energy expenditure. But it can account for up to 50% in some active individuals. So this is like a dial or a lever that we can really pull, especially when trying to get someone to be able to increase energy expenditure. And then the last and final component of our total daily energy expenditure is our exercise activity energy expenditure. And this essentially is the energy that we expend doing intentional exercise. And the thing is, and I had this conversation quite often with clients because, nowadays it's so prominent to have an Apple Watch or to have an Oura ring or all these calorie,
don't even get me started.
estimation. Yeah, no, estimation devices. And so a lot of people, and I want to hit on this because most people overestimate this first and foremost. They think they burn more during exercise than they do. But what you have to realize is that EAT or exercise activity thermogenesis actually accounts for the least amount of calories you burn per day. And on average, it only accounts for about 5% of our total daily energy expenditure. So really, yes, it is a great component. We want to exercise because there's so many positive adaptations that come, especially from something like resistance training in terms of muscular adaptations, neurological adaptations, all these, bone health, all these different types of downstream adaptations, but it's not a calorie expenditure tool. So I always try to enforce with people, we're utilizing strength training or resistance training to build muscle, which is, yes, going to increase your total daily energy expenditure due to the effects that it has on being able to carry around more muscle mass, which expends more calories at rest. And also, if we look statistically, muscle mass, essentially burns 3 times as many calories per pound as a pound of fat. However, it isn't a tool to be like doing circuits and trying to burn as many calories in that single session, trying to run up your Apple Watch numbers. Because first of all, the inaccuracy on that we see in some reports, it's like 23 to 92% off in terms of the variability in terms of its estimation as compared to how many calories you actually burn. But it's also accounting for very little. So you want to use the right tool for the right job, essentially.
Yeah,
I
and
have a quick question. Sorry. I'm just wondering, like, from your experience, like, you're talking about the different metabolic, components. I'm wondering how much, or maybe about the evidence, how much is genetically driven? Like, I feel like a lot of people are more fidgety, for example, so their NEAT might be more metabolically expensive, and it seems natural for them to always be moving around. So I'm wondering how much of that is genetics versus, just environment.
Yes, so absolutely. So if we actually look into like the obesity literature, generally they say between 50 to 70% of our actual baseline anthropometrics, so body composition stuff, are genetically driven. I kind of bias more on that 50% of things, just due to the fact that we have other research that reinforces that 50% number. But if we specifically look into NEAT, that component, we actually see in overfeeding studies. So for instance, James Levine he was actually the researcher and scientist that coined the term NEAT. And we see in overfeeding studies that it's highly variable. So for instance, he did an overfeeding study where it was 8 weeks in duration. And they increased the calorie amount that these individuals ate 1,000 calories over baseline for these 8 weeks. And they found that almost every single individual increased their NEAT levels and actually dissipated more energy as a result of eating more. So they ate more, they burned more. The average was around 328 calories, I believe, of increase in just the NEAT component. But keep in mind, when you overfeed, you're also seeing an increase in basal metabolic rate. You're seeing an increase in thermic effect of feeding. So for instance, if we just look like statistically, if it's 10% for the thermic effect of feeding, those individuals were burning 100 extra calories due to consuming 1,000 extra calories. So when we look at it in the NEAT component, the average was 328. However, there was, a few individuals that burned over 700 calories extra. So we see this massive variation. I believe there was a tenfold difference between participants in terms of their, what he used to refer to as a netotype. So essentially like your neat phenotype. And there was actually, and what's really interesting, and this is something that there isn't a lot of data on. However, if you actually look into the individual data points, so if you look at like the forest plot and you look at individuals across the spectrum of, increases in NEAT, and then also who went below the zero line, there was a few individuals that actually downregulated NEAT in the face of overfeeding. So those would be the people that I would assume, and it doesn't say this in the study, but we know individuals that when they have a huge meal, whether it be a Thanksgiving meal or they're at the Rodizio or whatever it may be, some of them are super hot. I'm telling you, I need another shirt. I'm sweating. I want to be up and moving. After Thanksgiving, I'm going to play football. However, there are some individuals that just sit there, they slouch, they get what's called postprandial somnolence, so that sleepy, sluggish feeling after eating especially a high carb meal. And so there is one individual that actually downregulated their energy expenditure in just the NEAT component by 92 calories. So they gained, a precipitous amount more than those individuals that increase energy expenditure by 700. So within that study, we see a tenfold discrepancy between weight gain, and it wasn't mapped like, so for instance, we know, there's this purported 3,500 calorie rule. So if you were to increase your calories or your calories by 1,000 for a week, that's 7,000 calories. You would expect that over the course of 8 weeks, hypothetically, you would gain 16 pounds. That's actually not what they saw. They saw some people gained, about 1.6 pounds, and then some people gained over 16 pounds due to that downregulation in NEAT. So it's highly variable. And what's interesting about that is that we actually see within that individual data points that women are less likely to upregulate NEAT than men are. And so we don't really know, these are just sex-specific differences. They didn't go into the physiological reasons as to why that was, but this is just what one study that is pretty much like the foundational evidence on this topic has shown. And they really haven't done too many overfeeding studies specifically looking at NEAT since then. But this is just, some data we can go off of.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was great explanation, man. And I know Dr. Erin, she's going to have a question sooner or later about female versus male with metabolic adaptation, but we are definitely going to have to explain to our audience what metabolic adaptation actually is. So if you don't mind, just kind of running through a brief explanation of what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So metabolic adaptation essentially refers to the collection of physiological adaptations our body goes through in responses to changes in our energy intake and our changes in body composition, and how those changes impact our energy expenditure. So the main thing this concept refers to is how our metabolism adapts and adjusts to changes in energy intake and body mass. And here's the thing, like we just spoke about a NEAT overfeeding study. I want people to realize that metabolic adaptation, although it's often just spoken about, and today we're going to speak about it in context of dieting, I do want people to know that it works on both the upwards, increasing calories as well as decreasing calories, because oftentimes when we speak about metabolic adaptation, people only look at it as this negative thing that occurs when we diet, but it occurs in both directions. And so it's important to realize that. We'll specifically talk about what happens during a dieting phase, because that's what the metabolic adaptation that most individuals, especially listening to this podcast, will go through. But many know that when we go into a calorie deficit and lose weight, our body adapts by downregulating certain metabolic processes to decrease our calorie expenditure in an effort to conserve energy. But this also happens in the opposite direction, like we were just speaking about. So, for instance, if we're to increase calories and we gain muscle or gain weight, such as during a reverse dieting phase or a building phase, our body adapts upwards and upregulates our metabolic processes that increase our energy expenditure. And so, another component of metabolic adaptation that I really want to tease out for your audience is the fact that it's multifactorial. And so a lot of times, often when people discuss metabolic adaptation, they solely focus on the reduction in metabolic rate that occurs as a result of losing weight. But it's only one component of metabolic adaptation, which is why I try to point out that our metabolisms are extremely adaptive, both in a downwards and then an upwards direction, depending on the phase we're in and what we're doing with our diet and our training. Now, what we see in the research in regards to dieting is something that's referred to as adaptive thermogenesis. So you'll actually see this used interchangeably, but they kind of refer to adaptive thermogenesis is a component of metabolic adaptation, but it's specifically referring to the fact that we experience a larger drop in energy expenditure than we'd purely expect based off of the total weight and body fat that we've lost during a fat loss phase. So this decrease in energy expenditure comes from a combination of factors, including a slight reduction in our basal metabolic rate, in addition to reductions that are even more substantial components of metabolic adaptation. And these weight loss induced adaptations will generally cause between an extra 5 to 15% reduction in total calories burned per day, depending on the magnitude of weight loss, the length that someone has been in a diet, their genetics, so something that Aaron hit on very much so. And this is essentially an adaptive mechanism put in place to stop us from losing too much weight. So this is what makes fat loss seem, or even, the feeling like when you're in a fat loss phase, this makes it more difficult because the longer you're in a deficit, the more metabolic adaptations you're going to be likely to incur. But it's important to note that these adaptations do not halt the process of fat loss. So it simply makes it so that we have to take a more intelligent and a strategic approach about how we approach, overcoming these obstacles. And also, I think, I've spoken about this topic many times, and sometimes people catastrophize what metabolic adaptation is, and they're like, well, how do I avoid it? It's almost like the boogeyman. It's like, we cannot avoid metabolic adaptation. However, we can mitigate and manage its effects. And also, we can have awareness of what's going on. So, for instance, the largest component, and we'll go really into the data on this, but the largest component of metabolic adaptation is actually from our NEAT component. So, drops in subconscious activity levels. Now, let's think about interventions we can utilize. We can utilize a Fitbit or a step tracker. We can increase our step count. We can make sure that we're active. We can park in the back of a parking lot rather than in the front when we're dieting. So there's these lifestyle, habitual, and behavioral interventions that we can utilize to essentially create interventions that work around these metabolic adaptations that are naturally occurring during an energy deficit.
Yeah. And
I was just that's a perfect cue for my question is, do you see sex differences in this metabolism, like the metabolic adaptation?
So in specifically to metabolic adaptation, I do not see sex specific differences. And the reason I can't speak on that extensively is because the literature has never bared out essentially the differences between men and women. However, what we do see is just a discrepancy in terms of an actual metabolic rate. So when we actually look at, body composition matched individuals. So we have a male and a female that have the same body composition, same fat mass and same lean mass. They'll actually have the same metabolic rate, and they'll have the same total daily energy expenditure as long as everything's clamped. So activity levels, their training levels, and their actual body composition. So if we have for instance, if we have a male and female that are 150 pounds at 20% body fat, they're on the same training program, they're doing 10,000 steps per day, they'll actually have the same baseline levels of resting metabolic rate as well as total daily energy expenditure, which actually a lot of people don't realize. They think there's actually this myth in this industry that women automatically have a lower resting metabolic rate. And the reason we see that, and here's the thing, for every claim that there is in this industry, there's often a grain of truth in it, which makes it seem a lot more believable. So for instance, when I look, and I work with many clients that they're couples. And so for instance, if we just look, I use you two. Vinny, say you're 210 pounds and Aaron, you're 120 pounds. You guys have completely different body compositions. So I'm pretty good with my estimation about that.
You had to work down the Jersey Shore on the boardwalk and guess people's weights.
So we have two different body compositions, but say, I'm dieting both of you guys. Well, we have to keep in mind that Aaron's, maintenance calories are going to be far less than yours. So to induce an energy deficit, not only are we going to have to take our calories lower, but also if I was to equate the calorie deficit that I utilize for Vinny and for Aaron, and I gave them both a 500 calorie deficit, we'll do the stock standard fitness, industry 500 calorie deficit. It's going to be much more of a substantial decrease in Aaron's, total calorie intake than it is for Vinny. So say, Vinny, you're eating 3,000 calories and Aaron, you're eating, 2,000 calories. If I take your calories down to Vinny by 500, that is a 1/6 drop in your total energy intake. And that's about 16.7%. And Aaron, if I took your calories down by 500 at 2,000, that would be a 25% deficit. However, you guys are going to lose at the same rate of loss. And so that's really what we see, where we have men and women that see each other and they say, well, my husband can lose so much quicker. Well, first and foremost, he can create a larger deficit because he has a higher maintenance calorie intake. But when we actually look at statistically, and in the research, so there's a great research paper by Poncer and colleagues, 2021, where they looked at, and actually the strongest correlate to our resting metabolic rate accounts for, an R squared value of, when you actually do the R squared equation, it's about 70% of your resting metabolic rate is accounted for your lean body mass. And here's the thing, when we actually look, between sex differences between males and females, women on average have 10% more body fat than males do, and 10% less lean mass. And that's not only due to essential body fat levels, but also, obviously activity levels, things of that sort. Also, kind of how we culturally are, I guess, and socially engineered in terms of men are obviously a lot more active in terms of weight bearing sports and things of that sort. So yes, we don't see in the actual literature on metabolic adaptations differences in sex. However, we do see differences in the real world where it's a lot of times I'll have women that tell me that they've had such a difficult time dieting. Or another thing, we have to think about the psychological side. I will say, and this is from personal experience, but you can also look in literature on this. For instance, a 2018 study looked at the prevalence of dieting each and every year between sexes. Men were 42% of men that were surveyed were likely to go on a diet each and every year. 61% of women reported going on a diet each and every year. So we're looking at a 20% discrepancy in and of itself. So women more likely with a chronic dieting history, they might have some sustained metabolic adaptations due to the fact that they haven't been in a state of energy balance or back to maintenance calories long enough. So when we look just head to head, if we were to put them into a randomized control trial, we're probably not going to see differences in metabolic adaptation. But when we look in the real world and we're working with clients, and I look at Vinny that has, or I look at my male client that has 5 diets over 25 years, and I look at my female client that has 30, there's going to be a huge amount of differences. And that's where real world coaching comes into play.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think mindset has a lot to do with that too. So like, even with like females, like I have a harder time, this is anecdotal evidence here, but I have a harder time trying to feed them up. I call it my metabolic capacity phase. I have a harder time getting them to dive into that and buy into it compared to a male. And I think that has 100%. A lot to do with, society and how they ingrained it on women. They need to be little, and it goes against all their conventional wisdom to where they're like, I know if I don't want to get bigger, I need to eat less. And it's like, yeah, but we got to work it up. And they're less, there's less of a buy-in with women to where guys are just like, yeah, let's go. Like, I'm okay with that. So I think a mindset thing has to do with it. But I would love to know if there's actually any like physiological differences with metabolic adaptation with that.
Now, one area we can look at, and this is a different topic that I could come on and speak on for another hour on. So this is a little bit separate of a tangent. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole. So pull me back in within 2 minutes if I keep going. There is a field which is looking at relative energy deficiency in sport, or relative energy deficiency syndrome. And these are physiological ramifications or downregulations as a result of being in low energy availability. What we do see with women is they're more susceptible to negative effects from low energy availability. And low energy availability essentially means that it's essentially a very disproportionate amount of calorie intake compared to calorie expenditure. So we actually look at the equation. It's your energy intake minus your energy expenditure from exercise relativized towards your level of fat-free mass. So it's a kind of a complex equation. You have to get the DEXA and things to really equate it. But we see that women see perturbations in energy availability, or perturbations in their menstrual cycle disturbances, their sex hormone production. They see it at a much more sensitive threshold. So about 30 kcals per kilogram of fat-free mass, we start seeing perturbations, meaning downregulations in sex hormone production, LH pulsatility. There's many research studies by Ann Locks and Olson that have looked at this specifically. But then when we actually look at men, it's really interesting. There was a case study. I'm trying to think. Carl Langen, I believe, is the author on the case study. But there's a case study of a Taekwondo athlete. He's a male. And during his entire fight camp for 8 weeks, he was at 20 kcals per kilogram. So 10 kcals per kilogram of fat-free mass less than the females that are seeing perturbations in energy availability. And he did not see downregulations in testosterone production, elevation in cortisol, really disparate changes in his baseline, metrics and blood work until he got to 10 kcals per kilogram of fat-free mass. So there is quite a discrepancy in terms of the threshold, but energy availability and energy deficits are two different things, because energy balance equation essentially refers to our total daily intake minus our total daily energy expenditure, and it's not just exercise activity, whereas low energy availability and REDS is really looking at very high-end athletes that are overexpending. So it's the person that's chronically underfueling themselves and overexercising. And we do see that to be very prominent within the literature on female athletes. So it's more of like the subsect. That's why it's referred to as relative energy deficiency in sport. But in that field, there is very much sex-specific differences. However, we got to kind of tease it out from metabolic adaptation and then relative energy deficiency.
I know we're getting down a rabbit hole, but it's actually quite interesting to me, at least. Mm-hmm. So biologically speaking, I think of mitochondria, like mitochondrial differences between men and women, right? Just evolutionarily speaking, women are meant to be able to handle starvation a little bit better. And you are talking about REDS, which I think a lot of physicians, may not be aware of, since, the Olympic Committee kind of came up with this set of diagnostic criteria essentially for female athletes. I think, Absolutely. It's becoming more popular, especially as we look at teenagers. So, for example, the Boston Children's Hospital now has a very specific program for REDS. But I'm just curious of your opinion of maybe this has to do with some mitochondrial differences, and as to why females might be affected, especially athletes?
So I wouldn't say that it's coming down. So we do know that there's differences in not only how women's mitochondria respond, but also their oxidative capacity. So women are more fat burners, essentially. They have more, their mitochondria, even their proteins in their muscle are actually more oxidative. They're going to rely off fat metabolism rather than carbohydrate metabolism, which is where men are more biased. So actually, if we actually look into, say, like contest prep dieting, so we actually go into metabolic adaptation literature, we look at the leanest women in these case studies, they actually have much less of a disposition towards lean body mass loss than males are. And that's for multiple reasons. Estrogen has, skeletal muscle remodeling factors. It helps with decreasing protein degradation, things of that sort. But they're also more reliant on fat for fuel than they are both carbohydrates and tapping into protein as fuel. However, I think it's more of an energy conservative mechanism because we have to think about it from like an ancestral perspective. Women, we're the ones that were completely responsible for the extension and the continuation of our species. And so I think that their ability to withstand very high levels of stress as well as low energy availability is mostly for that. And that's also, if we look anthropologically, like if we look into really like ancestral history, that is also the what people and researchers posit is the reason for their elevated level of essential body fat. So we look on a male, it's generally about 3% essential body fat levels, whereas with females it's around 12%. So there's discrepancy, but it's also so they have enough body fat stored on their body to be able to essentially continue first of all have reproductive capacity, but also to carry a baby to term. Whereas male, like, listen, Vinny, you and I, we do the deed, we're done. Like, we can be we done and gone. It doesn't matter because we're not responsible for that. So I think that there's many, I think this is part of the research that really needs to get more teased out. I do find women's physiology to be, first of all, a very heavily understudied component of exercise science. Vinny and I have spoken about this, but exercise science is a soft science. But really, we need to get a lot more. And I'm really on board with doing more studies on, sex-specific differences. I have to give a big credit to a mentor of mine that I have an immense amount of respect for, Dr. Bill Campbell. He's out of University of South Florida. He does a lot of women-specific research. I have an immense amount of respect for him. Absolutely. And so there are certain people, Abby Smith-Ryan out of UNC, they're really pushing this industry forward, but we're going to have to wait a little bit more to really see that. But I will say, if we go back to relative energy efficiency, you actually mildly hit on this, is it actually started as a female athlete triad. So that was Barbara Drinkwater in the 80s and 90s that termed that. The concept of relative energy deficiency never was put forward until 2014 with the IOC consensus statement for the International Olympic Committee. So this is something we didn't even know it applied to males until 2014, where they really started seeing more of these case studies where they were saying, all right, we have the female athlete triad, which is essentially amenorrhea or the cessation of a menstrual cycle. We have low bone mineral density, or the really leading it to osteoporosis, and then disordered eating behaviors, essentially under fueling. And we're seeing this triad, but there's so many other ramifications which also lead into metabolic adaptation. So one of the biggest things I have an interest for, and I really hope that this field keeps pushing in, is we have all these different sectors within research. And I'm someone that I like looking at all these different sectors, and I try to take pieces. I kind of have the Bruce Lee mentality: take what's useful and discard what's useless. And so we have all these different sectors. We have the relative energy deficiency spectrum, which is really looking at athletes. We have metabolic adaptation, which is really big in the obesity literature and the dieting literature. And then we also have energy compensation, which is like the constrained energy model, which is Herman Poncer's stuff. And that's more of like he's looking more at like an ancestral history. He's looking at like the Hadza and things of that sort. If we could really blend in this, I do know that these researchers are trying to come together to really create like a full consensus on everything that's going on, from decreases in energy availability, decreases in calorie intake, and the body's energy conservation mechanisms as a result.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting field. Like even, in medicine, like from the medical side, they're looking, at what they call omic stuff. So like the microbiome and, looking at specifically metabolic disorders to kind of quantify what cellular differences there might be. I think it's, if we can all come together in one thing, it would be amazing. But I think science, that's one of the issues with science, is sometimes we don't communicate across fields.
Very siloed industries.
Yes.
Well, I gave you guys over 2 minutes there, so I'm going to breeze back into metabolic.
Back to metabolic adaptation.
Yeah. But no, so a crucial part of metabolic adaptation is obviously the decrease in NEAT, because NEAT, like you said earlier, it has one of the biggest effects on how much we're burning per day. So when we're decreasing, like when we go into a deficit, and I remember like when I was competing, it was my first pro show at the WBFF, and I was saying like thank you to people and my coaches and stuff. And every time I blinked, it was like a slow blink. And I was like,
I've been there.
I was like, damn, like I didn't even realize that. But like your body literally slows that stuff down. So can you go into a little bit of that with like maybe how to not mitigate it, because we can't basically avoid metabolic adaptation, right? It's a natural process. But instead of trying to avoid it, how can people and professionals like ourselves, because there's going to be some coaches that listen to this, what can they do to account for when planning for metabolic adaptation?
All right. So from a coaching perspective, I think awareness is really important. So Vinny, you're specifically hitting on NEAT, which a lot of people overlook first and foremost. This is something that I remember just a few years ago, people weren't counting, tracking steps and things. I remember, I've done many presentations on energy flux, which is another concept that I utilize and a model that I utilize with a lot of my clients, which centers around the concept of eating more and moving more and has a lot to do with step titrations and tracking steps and things of that sort. However, a lot of people aren't even aware of the significance of NEAT because there's so much emphasis on metabolic adaptation in the component of resting metabolic rate. Everyone fears their metabolism being damaged or downregulated or broken or all these things. And what a lot of people don't realize is that reductions in NEAT account for actually approximately 85 to 90% of the downregulations in our total calorie expenditure that we experience as a result of metabolic adaptation. So if we actually, the first thing we need to realize is the significance of this. So for instance, we have literature that shows that your total daily energy expenditure can drop by over 400 calories per day just through the impact weight loss has on your NEAT levels. So, say that you were looking to lose 1 pound per week and you were utilizing a 500-calorie deficit. If you were not to pay attention to your NEAT levels, track them, make sure they're either being maintained or titrated up, that could essentially negate the vast majority of your deficit. Think about it. If you're downregulated 400 calories and you're in a 500-calorie deficit, that 500-calorie deficit just went to a 100-calorie deficit. So 80%
Crazy.
of your total calorie deficit is now negated. And so, oftentimes people don't realize this, how significant this reduction in NEAT is. So a lot of times you'll hear people, and I have these conversations on a daily basis with clients that have done dieting phases in the past, and they tell me CECO doesn't work. And they do so because the deficit they were in, based on whatever be an online calorie calculator or what some guru told them or an estimation equation, it didn't yield the fat loss that they expected based off the total deficit that it was supposed to create. But also they don't take into account that they could have downregulated NEAT. So for instance, one thing that I do with all my clients is I take and have them track NEAT off the bat. And so I don't ever, I don't want to say ever because that's essentially always, but most times, more times than not, 9 out of 10 people that come to me, they're not in the position to diet, to be honest with you. And I'm sure you guys can both relate to that. They either have physiological reasons that they can't diet or psychological reasons, and the vast majority of people have both. And so within that, I do something called a primer phase. And really what I'm trying to do is prime their body, both internally and also their mind, to be able to have better habits, really have better foundational behaviors and things that are going to set them up for success long term. So I do this primer phase previously, and I make sure that they're eating at maintenance or maintenance plus. Generally, I'm dialing in their habits around food, their diet quality, their movement practices. So making sure they're doing daily walks. I like post meal walks for the improvements in insulin sensitivity and blood glucose, as well as it helps with decreasing bloating, gas, all this type of things. And so I'm trying to get them into a movement practice. So for instance, say I have an individual that is at 8,500 steps per day. That's usually the baseline minimum that I put for most of my clients. And the reason for that is there's research out of University of Texas that looks at metabolic consequences of low activity levels. And they did a step titration study, and they did one at 2,700 steps, 5,600 steps, and 8,500 steps. And the only one that actually saw, improvements in insulin sensitivity, blood glucose management, postprandial glycemia, all these different things were at 8,500 steps per day. Yeah. So that's really where you can actually clear, when you have a glucose and a fat challenge, so it was a glucose and lipid challenge, you can effectively clear both glucose and fatty acids from the bloodstream. And so I really set that as like a baseline minimum. If someone's really low, I work them up over, subsequent weeks or months. If someone's, at 4,000 steps per day, it's not like, hey, week one, we go from 4,000 to 8,500. Like that's 100%, over 100% increase. That's not what we're doing. I'm titrating them up during the primer phase. However, as we start the diet, I'm having them track that baseline, activity levels. And from there, I'm either keeping it, clamped, meaning base, just consistent, or throughout the course of the phase, I may increase steps. And the reason for that is we have to realize that metabolic adaptation has many downstream effects. So to go back to what Aaron was speaking about with mitochondrial change, we actually see that mitochondrial efficiency increases during an energy deficit. So what ends up happening is remember, we have to waste energy in terms of the process of turning, food into chemical energy through the process of ATP production. And so within that, our mitochondria become more efficient where they burn less calories for that ATP production. And so we see this mitochondrial efficiency increase. So we see down regulations in all different components of your total daily energy expenditure. So we see in the BMR, we see it in the NEAT component, we see it in the exercise activity thermogenesis component, we also see it in the thermic effect of feeding. However, specifically in terms of movement, we become more economical. So for every step we take, every bicep curl we do, we're burning less energy for that exact same activity. So for instance, if I start someone out and they're at 8,500 steps, 8 weeks into the diet, that 8,500 steps isn't burning as many calories as it was week one of the diet. So we need to titrate that up to be able to at least offset those down regulations, both in subconscious NEAT, which are coming from, blinking less, not speaking with your hands as much, not going out to get your mail, when the post office guy comes, things like that, but also to be able to ensure that we're trying to eradicate as much as those down regulations that's NEAT as possible. Because keep in mind, most of NEAT is subconscious, meaning it's things that we don't even think about. There is no one that, taps their foot all the time that is going to consciously, realize, hey, listen, I'm not tapping my feet as much, so I'm going to purposely tap my feet. Like most people aren't going to do that. Tapping your, speaking with their hands, it's not like someone's going to automatically during a diet realize that they're down regulated and start saying, like Vinny, like you said, you were blinking slower. And I'll tell you personally, I was at a presentation a week after North Americans in 2018. It was bodybuilding.com headquarters, speaking in front of 400 individuals there. And there's a video of me. And the VP of my company was like, what was wrong with you? Because I'm a very lively and energetic person. I have ADD. I'm constantly moving. I'm all over the place. He goes, are you all right? And I said, what do you mean? I thought I killed the presentation, to be honest with you, because cognitively I was there, but physically I was not. And he goes, dude, you were blinking like half as slow as usual. Your hands did not move. And that I know something's wrong with you in that case. And so, these are things we're not conscious of. You're not going to start blinking quicker. You're not going to start moving your hands if that is something that's subconsciously downregulated. So what component of NEAT do we have that's in our control? Our step count. So that's where titrating steps up, utilizing a step tracker, really staying on top of it and looking at weekly averages over time and making sure that it's not coming down. Because I will tell you that I started utilizing what I call a high energy flex model in about 2015, and really it's become more evolved as time has went on. This term energy flux wasn't actually termed in the literature until 2018, so I used to just call it daily step tracking. And I will tell you that there was many times that before this was prominent, I had individuals that wouldn't really check their step count throughout the day, or they would only check it at the end of the week and then give me an average. And I remember having clients that were starting at 10,000 steps per day in a building phase or in a maintenance phase prior to us going to the diet. And we're 2 weeks in, they're at 6,000 steps per day. And so obviously, we would have to get a calorie estimation for every 2,000 calories, approximately like 80 to 100 calories. But say it was 100 calories. That is 200 calories that you just reduce your energy expenditure per day. And now you're in a 500 calorie deficit, but really you're in a 300 calorie deficit. And you're wondering why you're not seeing the weight loss that you expect.
Yeah. And I would say, even from a coaching perspective, trying to account for that. So making your client aware of, hey, this might happen. So as we get leaner and leaner, let's start being a little bit more cognizant of what is going on. Maybe you do have to set a timer and get up, do the Pomodoro effect. And during that 5 minutes, go walk for a little bit just to keep that up. I like to do the step count too. A lot of people do the 10,000 steps per day. I'm more like, where are you? Like initially, because if you come at me like 5,000 steps, I'm not going to tell you to jump up to 10. I might tell you to jump up to 75 because we could get that. It's doable.
Absolutely.
But I think it's a great way to be able to increase or keep our NEAT high while not adding too much stress to the body. So, and I think that's very overlooked with coaching and dieting in general.
Absolutely. It's a low barrier of entry method that is not systemically taxing. It's not going to have a recovery debt. And actually, if you look in the literature on active recovery modalities, actually walking facilitates not only nutrient delivery, it facilitates better blood flow. It actually has recovery aiding capacity. And also, I'll tell you just some interventions I utilize with clients. So I like post-meal walks. So think about it. We're doing a habit stacking technique, pretty much just out of James Clear's book. And so Atomic Habits, he doesn't speak about walking, but for instance, if you're gonna eat a meal, you're gonna eat 3 to 4 times a day. That's something you're going to do day in and day out. Just tack on a 10-minute walk right after. Or, with the alarm thing, I've done that many times with my office workers. Listen, every hour, and here's the thing, sometimes, there's clients will be like, I don't think I can do this. And it's like, listen, your coworkers that aren't into fitness are going for a smoke break every hour for 5 minutes. So you get up and you do a lap of the building or go to the furthest bathroom. Or another thing I'll tell them to sometimes is like, listen, front load your water early in the day. prior to going to work, and then they have to get up to go to the
Gotta go
bathroom.
to the bathroom.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I like every 1 hour going for 5 minutes of a walk, just trying to intersperse activity into your day, because we see that there's an independent effect of sedentary activity that actually decreases your actual metabolic health. So even if you are, there interventional studies where they look at just sitting for the entire course of the day and then doing an hour bout of intense exercise, and they don't, and then they compare it into those same individuals. So it's a crossover design where they go through each component, and when they have someone get up throughout the course of the day and do their regular step count in addition to that aerobic or that resistance training effort at the end of the day, they see much better metabolic outcomes. However, when they are to be sedentary, or they're sedentary throughout the entire course of the day, and then they try and make up for it, like many do, where they go to the gym for an hour a day, they check the box, and they say, oh, I had my exercise. They see that actually it leads to, over time, insulin resistance, an inability to clear both fatty acids as well as glucose out of the bloodstream. And so there's metabolic consequences of that, not only in terms of your metabolic health, but also longevity. There's many studies that show that sedentary activity actually decreases mortality and things of that sort. And also from like a cognitive perspective, if you are someone, I work with a lot of high level executives, like walking is going to help increase BDNF. There's going to be many cognitive benefits of just getting up, getting out of your workspace, getting out of that stressful environment, and just having a reprieve, going, doing some deep breath work, as you go walk for 5-10 minutes. It's going to have a lot of benefits, not only to your physical health, your mental health, your cognition, your ability to articulate yourself, and things of that sort.
Yeah. And before we get off this little tangent here, just real quick. So like, even with diet interventions, right? Like I know I'm big on like reading my clients' biofeedback and all the data. Like, give me all the data, let me make the right decisions. There's times where diet breaks, or people call them maintenance breaks, whatever it is. There's time where like I feel like they need to be implemented. I also feel like refeeds are also good, especially like if you have competitors going on stage, like throw refeeds in there. How does that affect metabolic adaptation? Does it slow it down? Like, what do you think about that?
All right, so we need to tie this out a little bit differently. The literature on what are called intermittent dieting strategies. So what you're referring to, it's essentially a broad classification of intermittent dieting strategies that includes refeeds, high carb days, as well as diet breaks. From a physiological perspective, we don't see a benefit from them. If you actually look into literature, Pios et al. 2021, you look at Campbell et al., just a recent study that he came out. It's actually Madeline Seidler is the primary author on that research study. Those are both diet break studies. There is one by Dr. Bill Campbell that is a refeed study that saw better preservation of lean body mass and metabolic rate, but that's the only one that we had that has any physiological benefits. So when we actually look at intermittent dieting strategies from a physiological side, it's not going to reverse metabolic adaptation, because we're not staying at maintenance calories or in energy balance for long enough. So just from a pure physiological perspective, no. However, we have to consider the physiology or the psychology. And so with all of those, we see better benefits from a disinhibition perspective, from a diet adherence perspective, from a mood stability. And also in POS, they actually did a secondary analysis of training throughout the week of a diet break, and they actually saw better muscular endurance from the week of being in a diet break. So these are things I do utilize, because we have to realize that it's not just about physiology, it's also about psychology. So I use a reactive approach to implementing intermittent dieting strategies. So for instance, with a refeed perspective, you brought up the competitors. Yes, I actually utilize 2-day refeeds quite frequently. And the reason for that is it's practicing peaking strategies. It is allowing me to have a 2-day period to see what increases in carbohydrate availability, how they fill out, how they feel, digestion, all these different things, trialing different methods, and then also seeing how long it takes them to dry out after, or to essentially to assimilate those carbohydrates, restore glycogen, be full, but also tight at the same time. Because if we just wait till the end of a contest prep, that's really playing Russian roulette. Also, in terms of a diet break capacity, I actually refer to this as the strategy that I utilize is a deficit deload. And that's how I categorize it, or I explain to my clients. Diet break, I was utilizing them very early on. One of the first people that ever spoke about them was Lyle McDonald, and I started implementing them in the same fashion as he did, where it was a 1-week diet break, essentially, where you raise calories back up to maintenance, predominantly from carbohydrate. And at the time, we believe that you should do it from carbohydrates because of the increase in leptin that come along with increasing carbohydrates as compared to increasing fats, which literally, when we do overfeeding studies of carbohydrates versus fats, we don't see any effect, even from overfeeding fats, on leptin levels, whereas we do see an increase in a substantial increase, a significant increase in leptin levels from increasing carbohydrates. However, with the diet break, what oftentimes I realized clients were having they looked at that term or heard that term, and it was like all bets are off. They utilized different food sources. They blew their calories on occasion, and sometimes it was really hard for them to psychologically get back on the horse.
Yeah.
So what I had originally utilized as a way as a reprieve to reset them mentally and physically was actually causing more harm than good. So now I phrase it as a deficit deload. We're pulling off systemic stress both from dietary fatigue perspective as well as physical fatigue perspective. I want you to utilize the same food sources that have been helping you be satiated and be successful in terms of your actual fat loss phase. But all we're doing is increasing the portions of those foods so you're extra satiated. You have more glycogen to be able to train harder, get better pumps in the gym, look better cosmetically. There's all these different benefits. And I also like to align them with high stress periods in their life, whether it be they're moving, or for instance, I just transitioned one of my clients, Michael, into a diet break yesterday because his wife, is about to have a baby. And so these are things that we can implement. And it doesn't have to be like these paradigms that we used to see where it was like, you have to do, it's 8 weeks on, 1 week diet break, or, a 5-2, refeed structure. It's really reactive. I believe that coaching is a reactive system. We can't predict, and I'm going to be completely transparent. And sometimes, clients I'll have this conversation with them and they'll say, oh, you can't do that. And it's like, I can't tell the future. And I have almost 11 years of experience, but I can't tell what your body's going to respond to in advance. So I can tell you a forecast of what I believe our plan will be leading forward, but I would be doing you a disservice if I proactively programmed everything we're doing for the next 4 to 6 weeks, because then I'm not taking your biofeedback, your personal, account, your personal feelings, subjective feelings, everything I'm reading within your check-in into account when actually making those adjustments and those changes into your plan. It is a week by week basis. We take this one day at a time, one check-in at a time, and I'm changing things based on your biofeedback, the assessments that I'm making in terms of gauging your progression, as well as if I see down regulations in all biofeedback markers. So someone's sleep is shit. They have extreme hunger through the roof. They're unable to, really get through their workouts. They're having a really big decrease in work capacity in terms of like set to set progressions. We're seeing them go from, say, we're doing, an exercise, incline dumbbell press, and they're doing 3 sets of 12, but they're going from 12, 8, 6. And usually they're 12, 12, 12. Those decreases in work capacity could be due to carbohydrate availability, things like that. That's where it's like, listen, we're going to implement this and, essentially refuel, put gas back into the tank, and then we'll push on from there. And really within coaching, there's a time to push your clients and there's a time to pull back.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm glad that you touched on the psychological aspect of the whole maintenance break. So yeah, and I'm not a macros coach, so I'm not giving my clients macros and say, hey, have fun on a maintenance break. Like you're gonna have a plan. Like if you're eating jasmine rice, like stick to that carb. Like your body's already digesting it, knows it, like it's used to it. So listen, you're at 125 grams. Maybe we bump it up to 200 or 175, whatever it is. Like stick with the same food. So I'm glad you touched on those 2 points. For anybody that's hearing this and like wants to try going into a maintenance break, stick with the food you're doing. Just eat a little bit more of it, right? Like that. It's the simplest way to go about it. Dr. Aaron, do you have any questions for him before? Because I keep going off.
I thought it was interesting because when you talked about refeeds, it seemed like from the research out there, it seemed like a very temporary thing, right? Like our body readjusts very quickly to what it's accustomed to, especially if you're dieting down.
What's interesting about that is a lot of people look at that as a negative. So what Aaron is alluding to is the fact that we see transient increases in leptin, in thyroid hormone production, all these different metabolic markers that are downregulated during a diet, during a refeed, due to increases in calories and increases in carbohydrate availability. However, that works on the same end of the spectrum for metabolic adaptation. Metabolic adaptation is a transient and a temporary state. And I really want people to understand, I'll say it again, it's a transient and temporary state. Once you get out of an active weight loss phase where you are out of an energy deficit, you are no longer actively losing weight, you get back to maintenance calories or above or beyond, you're going to reverse those metabolic adaptations. So the same thing happens in the opposite side, as Aaron is speaking about, where you go from being in an energy deficit, then you're out of a deficit back to maintenance, and then you go right back into a deficit. You're going to incur those metabolic adaptations once again. So for every gimme, there's a gotcha, but you have to realize within that phase, if that was what was going to help a client stay adherent to the program, it was going to help them get through not only that week, but the rest of that phase. That is, we have to look at the cost to benefit ratio, and that is really skewed in the way of benefits over costs. However, when it comes down to actual metabolic adaptation, this is essentially a temporary state. So for instance, one of the best research that we have on this, there's a research group from Katia Martins, and so she looks at she does meta-analysis on these topics. She does an immense amount of research on the topic of metabolic adaptation, and really there's a huge debate in the literature right now, or there was the last few years until her research group really honed in on this. And it was, is metabolic adaptation a permanent thing? Is it something that stays and exists past the active weight loss phase itself. And so this is where there's many, and we can get into this, like some of these myths like starvation mode or metabolic damage and things of that sort. But really what she and her research found was that, there's a prevalence in our space where people think that metabolic adaptation not only exists past the weight loss phase itself, but also that it could persist in a fact that it makes you gain weight over time. And so this is not something we see in actual, like our randomized control studies. So for instance, her research group did one where they investigated the relationship between metabolic adaptation and subsequent weight regain. Because a lot of people will say, listen, if I incurred a large degree of metabolic adaptation during a diet, does that predispose me to gaining more weight after? Because now my metabolism is suppressed. And what they did was in 2020, they did a research study where they looked at the degree of metabolic adaptation during a diet and the weight regain in over 170 women who had dieted and lost around 16% of their body weight, which is a significant degree of weight loss. And at the end of the active dieting phase, they measured these participants' metabolic rate. And they did see that there was metabolic adaptation. They were just having actively lost weight. And so they had a little over a 50-calorie reduction in their resting metabolic rate due to metabolic adaptation. They then followed them up and remeasured the resting metabolic rate at 4 weeks post-diet, at 1 year post-diet, and also at 2 years of essentially weight loss maintenance. And when they reanalyzed their metabolic rate after they were in a state of energy balance for 4 weeks, so they were just eating, back at maintenance calories for 4 weeks, they did not measure any degree of substantial or significant metabolic adaptation. And they also found no association between the degree of metabolic adaptation the women had experienced during the diet and their chance of weight regain within not only those 4 weeks, not only that 1 year, but 2 years of finishing that weight loss phase. So we have to realize if this really is a temporary state, this is something, and that's oftentimes people will ask me, well, how do we avoid it? I don't want to incur this, and they're kind of scared of dieting because of this. And it's like, listen, you really should get in. If you have a goal and fat loss is your goal, let's get in. Let's make an effective deficit that's not too aggressive, high protein, make sure we're prioritizing resistance training. You're using whole foods to be able to feel satiated and be able to manage hunger and appetite and things of that sort. But let's get in, get fat loss off. And then instead of being this chronic dieter where you're going in a deficit and out of a deficit, all these things, let's make sure that we get in, we get the goal accomplished, and we get out and back to maintenance or beyond. And we really look at a longer period of being at maintenance than we are in an actual diet. Because what the average person does is they diet for a few weeks and then they're overeating. Or, I call this the weekday dieter, Monday through Friday. They're on point. They're under fueling themselves, and they're eating in a deficit. And then during the weekends, they go out, they have some drinks, they have some meals, and they go into a massive surplus. And they're already metabolically adapted from being in a deficit throughout the week. So now their fat storage enzymes are increased. Now their metabolic rate is decreased. Their total daily energy expenditure is decreased. So they're more likely to store fat because they have a lower total daily energy expenditure, and they're more insulin sensitive because they've lost fat out of fat cells, and fat cells do have the ability to become more insulin sensitive from caloric deficit. So now they're storing more fat on weekends. They're not losing as much fat during the week. They're under fueling themselves, incurring metabolic adaptations, and they're on this like perpetual dieting circle. It's like this wild ride where they're on the diet, off the diet, on the diet, off the diet, never getting any results and never looking better. They're becoming a smaller, essentially less muscular version of themselves, and they're never getting to where they want to be. They lose a little bit of weight, they regain that weight, and even then some. And then they always have to restart a diet just to make up for what they've done in the past. Whereas if you were just to be intentional, and this is always what I talk to my clients about, we're going to intentionally approach this goal. This is we're not dipping our toes into a fat loss phase. It's if you want to go into fat loss phase, we're going to periodize. We're going to plan this. It's going to be phasic. We're going to make sure that you have more than enough time to reach a goal. We're going to have phasic periods of pushing, meaning that we're going to be in an energy deficit. There's going to be times that I refeed you if necessary, or put you on a diet break. And once you're done, we're getting right back to maintenance and really working at first going through a maintenance phase, whether that be we can term this whatever you want. Some people in the industry don't want to call it a reverse diet. We can call it a reverse diet, a recovery diet, a maintenance phase, whatever you want to say. And we're going to get a portion after your weight loss phase where we have an exit strategy. So you can maintain the fat that you lost, but also upregulate the rest of the systems that were downregulated due to metabolic adaptation during a diet. And then from there, we're going to work on another goal, such as increasing your lean body mass, so that your next time dieting, you're in a better point in terms of not only the way your body looks from a body composition perspective, but your total daily energy expenditure. If you increase muscle mass, you're going to be able to burn more calories. And essentially, if you add a significant amount of muscle mass, you'll be able to diet on more calories over over time. It doesn't happen in one phase, but over the life course. Whereas most people, if you really look at it from like a statistical perspective, most people are losing more muscle over time because they aggressively diet, they lose lean body mass during the diet, they suffer from what's called body fat overshooting effect, which is essentially induced by hyperphagia, which is excessive hunger or persistent hunger from the loss of lean body mass. So they become not only fatter, but less muscular over time. And now they're dieting on less and less calories because their metabolic rate is lower due to that loss of lean body mass, not due to metabolic adaptation.
Yeah.
I just have a quick question, like, looking at this like big view, right? You're talking about, I know we're talking about metabolic adaptation and like small changes and how to manipulate that. But in general, what's your opinion on, do you think BMR is kind of a static number, or do you feel like most people's BMRs kind of have a range? And so there's some percentage that you can actually manipulate, but in general, they kind of have a range of their BMR. And that's why we're able to kind of, metabolically manipulate, if you will, their BMR.
I think we have to separate. If you actually look in the literature on BMR, we don't see not only a massive discrepancy between individuals, but we also don't see that BMR specifically changes significantly unless someone has added a significant amount of muscle mass. So for instance, for every pound of muscle that you gain, it's about 6 calories. And so you're really not gaining all that much, or actually, yeah, it's about 6 calories, I believe, 4 to 6 calories per pound gain. So you would have to gain a substantial amount of tissue to be able to actually increase your BMR, just your basal metabolic rate. However, I think we can increase your total daily energy expenditure. And the reason for that is because BMR is essentially the least modifiable component of our total daily energy expenditure, both on the way down and the way up. So for instance, when we look at actual research, and a lot of people are concerned about down regulations in BMR during a fat loss phase, a lot of people think that's like the largest component. But if we actually look at, there's research from Michael Rosenbaum's lab, and they've specifically looked at different aspects of total daily energy expenditure that have reduced during a diet. And they found even with significant weight loss, so these were participants that lost 10% of their body weight, their RMR, or the resting metabolic rate, only decreased by 100 calories. And we have many other studies. So for instance, I just spoke about the Martin study. They lost 16% of their body weight. It only decreased by 50 calories. So just like it only decreases a small bit, we're not going to see massive upregulations in BMR. The biggest that I've ever seen was an overfeeding study where they saw a 10 to 15% increase in baseline BMR. And that was massive overfeeding. It was 1,000 calories per day, sustained for 8+ weeks. And so I don't think it's BMR, but I do think your total daily energy expenditure can significantly increase. So that bandwidth that you're speaking about, that range, that maintenance range, but it's going to be from other components. So for instance, let's say that we look at all the other components of someone's total daily energy expenditure. So first we look at NEAT. NEAT, in a study by Black et al., they looked at the differences between two people of the same body composition and saw that NEAT can vary up to 2,000 calories despite two people having the same anthropometric data, meaning that same level of body fat, the same body mass, all these things, just based on their occupational activities and their daily activities, or their activities of daily living. So that's a 2,000 calorie discrepancy right there. So that could be, Vinny at 2,000 calorie Vinny, or Vinny at 4,000 calorie Vinny. It's a massive range. The other thing is, we can have an increase in thermic effective feeding. So we take someone from a very low protein, low fiber diet, and we put them on a higher protein, a higher carb, because carbs do have a higher thermic effective feeding than do fats, a moderate fat diet, and also a high fiber diet. We're going to increase their thermic effective feeding. Also, there's other components of things that can increase total daily energy expenditure, such as meal timing. So if you have consistent meal timing, we actually see a higher thermic effective feeding from that, just from the circadian rhythm aspect of chrononutrition, essentially. Then the last part, eat. If you gain more muscle and you're utilizing that muscle during a workout, you're going to increase energy expenditures. So all these things work in tangent, but I don't think we could isolate one component and say this is what's going to be a large range, because BMR just doesn't change that significantly unless you're looking at someone from the beginning of their training career until the end. So for instance, I've had many clients that I've taken, and they were newbies essentially, and over the course of 4 or 5 years, they're now 30 or 40 pounds larger with, predominance. And these are new trainees. So most males can gain from the beginning of their training career to the end, or within, like, say, the first 4 to 5 years of training, anywhere between 25 to 40 pounds. We even see, like, in the baseline literature, or even in like some of the best, like, evidence-based practitioners, Alan Aragon's a good friend of mine. He will say that the average male can gain between 12 to 24 pounds of lean body mass within their first year of training. That is like
And then
statistically what they say.
it kind of it evens
It
out.
starts,
After.
yeah. So what we actually see is it's almost like an asymptote. So it goes up and it keeps going up, but it's going down
It
slower. So
plateaus.
essentially, yeah. So it's like 12 to 24 pounds your first week, the first year of training, hard training, like significant, like progressive resistance training. Next year, cut that in half. Next year, cut that in half. You get 4 or 5 years in if you've been nailing everything. And this is the thing. I don't want people to catastrophize this, that you don't gain muscle past 4 or 5 years. Most of you aren't nailing it. So it's going to take you 10 years to get to that point. However, yes, it does slow down significantly. And we see the same thing. There's an asymptote in all these things. If you look in the literature on protein intake, there's a meta-analysis by Morton and colleagues, which is, it's interesting because everyone cites that. It's a 2018 meta-analysis, and I know you guys have heard it. It's 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein is the maximize muscle hypertrophy. However, you actually look at the most recent meta-analysis on protein intake. It's by Tagawa. It's 2020 meta-analysis. And they actually saw that there was an increase, a linear increase from 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram up to 3.5 grams of protein per kilogram, but it's so asymptotic, meaning it goes up substantially at 1.5. You see it rise really heavily, and then the line is like this, and it almost looks like it's not increasing, but you do get a couple more kilograms of fat-free mass for increasing that protein intake. So these are small, these are where the 1% we're talking about, which really do add up over a training career, or when we're working with people. I work with a lot of intermediate or advanced trainees, and that's where integrating some of these more nuanced perspectives, really dialing in different aspects of their training, their nutrition, their lifestyle, their sleep, their stress management. There's so many other things. So for instance, we can see, massive decreases in your lean body mass from discrepancies in sleep. So poor sleep quality. There's a study by Nedelcheva from 2010 where they looked at 5.5 hours versus 8.5 hours. And they had these two individuals, two groups, they crossed over the study, and both individuals went through both conditions of sleep. And and this was without resistance training. So we have to keep that as a caveat. But during the good sleep portion, when they had 8.5 hours of sleep, they lost about 80% of body weight from fat mass, and it was about 18 to 20% from lean body mass. However, when they switched them and they went to the 5.5 hour percentage, they actually saw the exact opposite. It flipped. And so they lost 80% of the same amount of weight that they had lost in the previous 2 weeks from lean body mass, and only about 20% from fat mass. So these are little things that can really make, and these are things people don't think about. Like you talk to clients about sleep quality, about stress management, all these different components, and it's so multifactorial, which is why coaching can never just come down to macros. It can't just come down to calorie adjustments or utilizing a calorie calculator. This is about really getting to know people, really explaining things to them, and then going over all these fine-tooth details. Like, listen, the first thing I do with all my clients, especially people with long dieting histories, I look for their bottlenecks. What has plagued them previously from being able to diet effectively and efficiently, and not only losing fat, but being able to keep it off? And most of it is that they're so extreme. I get a lot of type A personalities. I seem to attract them. I'm very much the same way. And so they're so extreme in their approach. They want to go all in on the deficit. Right. And what ends up happening is they not only severely restrict themselves, they overdo things in terms of the actual deficit that they create, but they also, it's so unsustainable that oftentimes they slip up, and they have this all or nothing mentality, or this black and white thinking where it's dichotomous. And so then, because they slipped up, they just go off the haywire, or, they essentially eat everything in sight, and then they regain a bunch of weight. They go back to, excessive restriction. So it's like this yo-yo dieting type of phenomenon where they're not getting the body composition results they want, nor do they have a good relationship with food as a result. And so these are the bottlenecks we have to look towards. Yes, there's many aspects of metabolic adaptation that we can mitigate through different strategies and stuff, but we also have to look at what causes a client to incur these metabolic adaptations. Is it because they were too severe in the deficit that they utilized? Is it because they didn't prioritize resistance training? They just did excessive cardio as their main modality of burning calories rather than preserving lean body mass? Is it because they didn't utilize a high protein diet? Is it because they didn't track their steps and they became very sedentary and not even realized it? And essentially they had to continue eating less and less and less until it was unsustainable and they could no longer lose any more fat? Or was it that they weren't aware of metabolic adaptation, had never heard of it, weren't aware of it, and so they didn't have a post-diet strategy? So they went from eating a very restrictive diet, being in an energy deficit, and then all bets were off once that diet phase ended. Once they got to the vacation, once they went to the cruise, once they, went after, got, to their wedding and they hit their goal, it was like they had no exit strategy in place, no plan of action. They had no thought of the future. And that's why they went through these subsequent cycles of losing weight and regaining it.
Yeah. And I think that's, I think it's really important, especially with like the exit strategy, because they want the goal, but then it's like, when you get to the goal, what's next? Right? Like, do you have a plan for after that? Like, we ask for a minimum of 6 months to work with us. That's Absolutely. A minimum. That's the least amount of time I want with you. But sometimes when that time comes up, it's like, all right, my 6 months is up and I've got the results I need. I'm like, all right, so you're going to stay with us so we could go into this exit strategy. Well, what do you mean? Oh, and then it's like, wait a minute, we talked about this. I guess you weren't listening, but here, this is what we need to do for your exit strategy. And we try to teach them on the exit strategy to be able to do it by themselves. Cause honestly, like I know it's not business savvy, but we're here to empower people, right? We're here to teach them the right way and then they could maybe pass it on. But yeah, no, I think it's very important to have that exit strategy going in. Brandon, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, man. You gave us a ton of information. But just to end this, can you just like sum up, like if you were to just say, hey, this is the most important advice I will give to anybody that's going into a dieting phase about metabolic adaptation, what would that advice be?
All right. So my overarching advice, and I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, but you guys both know I'm not concise. So we'll see how this goes. My overarching advice would be to be aware of metabolic adaptation. Do not fear it. Do not try to avoid it. Essentially, when we actually look into the research literature on metabolic adaptation, it is not a predictor of weight regain. It is not something that's going to completely limit your ability to lose body fat. It does not halt fat loss. It makes the process more challenging and more difficult. However, it is actually a sign and an indication of successful fat loss. So we actually see in research studies looking at the magnitude or the degree of metabolic adaptation one sustains. It's generally based on three components. It's the magnitude of weight loss, it's the length of the diet, and it's how long that person was able to keep up or how low in body fat that person was able to get and sustain that body fat level. So it's actually when you actually incur a deep degree of metabolic adaptation, like, so all three of us have incurred tremendous amounts of metabolic adaptation getting into stage shape. It's actually an indication of success. So think about it almost like you would hunger. A lot of people shy away from hunger and say, look at hunger as this negative thing. However, if you weren't hungry during a diet, I can almost guarantee you you're not in an energy deficit or you're on your way to being back to maintenance. And so really, these are indications we have to embrace. These are obstacles. And as with anything in life, nothing worth having is worth having, if it's just easy come, easy go. Because things that we're able to get in an instance are generally things we lose very, very quickly. So if you're able to take an approach where it's more intelligent, it's more strategic, you're able to mitigate some of these effects, utilize a high protein diet, have better food choices, utilize better food quality to ensure that you're satiated, utilize an effective deficit, but make sure that you're in a calorie deficit, not a nutrient deficit. So mind your micros, make sure that you're looking at your micronutrient intake, you're really dialing in whether it be your food choice selection, you're looking on chronometer, you're balancing everything out, you're tracking things accurately, because that's a big thing that a lot of people think that they're metabolically adapted and they're in a plateau, but actually it's a lack, or they're essentially underestimating their actual calorie intake. So there's research studies looking head to head at whether it's metabolic adaptation to blame for plateaus or it's actually adherence. And what they mean by adherence is actually sticking to the plan. And Kevin Hall has a great study on this. And so, that's another component. But really, an overarching thing is do not fear this. Realize that it's a part of the process. And this is something that every single one of us will incur. However, you can get around it by having a great mindset, realizing that it's a part of the process, and really being mindful of the things within your control. So for instance, there are going to be things in every aspect of our life that are within our control and outside of our control. So I'll go through a little list of things. You can now control your total BMR. That is something that is based on your body composition, where you're starting all these things. However, you can prioritize resistance training, making sure that you're having a progressive training stimulus to maintain as much muscle as possible, because we don't want to look for weight loss. We want actual fat loss. We want as much fat loss or fat mass coming off and as little lean body mass coming off. And ideally we would lose entirely fat mass and no lean body mass, and you'd actually recomp throughout this process. And so we want to prioritize resistance training as our main stimulus for maintaining muscle tissue, which will maintain your metabolic rate. Then from a NEAT component, make sure to mind your steps, track your steps, titrate them up over time, really be cognizant of your activity levels, and realize that is a huge vector for burning calories in a low intensity way. That is a low barrier of entry. Anyone can put on shoes and go outside or go on a treadmill, whatever it may be. Also has a very low recovery and fatigue cost as compared to high intensity interval training or doing step mill for hours at a time, things of that sort. Then from a thermic effective food perspective, I would say really be proactive in utilizing a high protein diet, not only for the fact that it has a higher level of diet induced thermogenesis, but also for its muscle retention benefits, its satiety benefits. There's so many downstream benefits of utilizing a high protein diet. And then from an exercise activity thermogenesis, try to maintain, and this is really a mindset thing more than a physical thing. We actually look at meta-analysis on training in an energy deficit. We do not see in most of the meta-analytic data, until you get into contest shape, you're not losing strength during an energy deficit. However, in people's mind, the first week they're in an energy deficit, they're like, dude, I'm taxing the gym. It's a mindset thing. I've dieted more times than anyone wants to know. And I'll tell you, as long as I go into the gym with a progressive mindset, utilize a little caffeine to decrease my perceived exertion, things of that sort. But if I'm able to get into a mindset that I'm training, you're not training for fat loss, you're training for muscle growth. So the same type of training program, if it's successful during a building phase in allowing you to accrue muscle tissue, utilize that during the fat loss phase, because what built your muscle will maintain your muscle. So it's not about going from utilizing heavy progressive resistance training where you're trying to utilize, say, a double progression, increasing both reps and load over time in, stable exercises that you are neurologically efficient in. It's not about going from that to going to circuit training or to doing high reps because you're going to burn in the cuts. These are things that they make no sense, and there's a lot of claims around them, but you have to check off each box of that. So look at every component of your total daily energy expenditure and see what areas you can dial in most in your life, and then also be objective with yourself. And sometimes that takes going to a coach. So like I spoke about my own process, I look for the bottlenecks in someone's lifestyle, in someone's previous approach, and why they held themselves back. And sometimes it is one of those components of their total daily energy expenditure. Sometimes it's their mindset. Sometimes they have a fragility narrative that they saw on social media. They think that they're metabolically resistant, or they've heard all these functional medicine, terms and things, and they think
started. That's
it becomes we got to do another podcast on that. Aaron, I would love I would love to get your opinion on this, because I will tell you, I've worked with over 1,000 individuals, and there are very few people that I will say that they are fat loss resistant, and there's zero people that I will say are physiologically fat loss resistant. Psychologically, a different thing. However, remember that you need to take and stop telling yourself this narrative that you can't do something just because you have had previous failures. That's a big thing within the dieting culture and dieting, community as a whole. People have previously bad experiences. You need to start on a fresh slate. Learn from your mistakes of the past, but don't let them hold you back from really being the best version of yourself. And don't allow self-limiting beliefs of what have happened in the past to prevent you from giving your best effort in the present moment and in this present fat loss phase.
Yeah, that's mainly touching on their identity and what they identify with, which was unsuccessful weight loss. And they think they're stuck to that, but it was just the wrong game plan. That's all it was. Like, you could lose weight, diets work, plain and simple, but you need the right game plan. Dr. Aaron, do you have any last questions for Brandon?
I have just a philosophical question for you.
Absolutely.
One, we really appreciate your time, and thank you for going through all the data. I appreciate it. I'm just wondering how you achieve balance between, dieting phases, and, you always look great in your pictures. So I'm just wondering, for our clients too, like how does someone like you achieve that kind of balance?
I think the number one thing I can say to that, to answer that, is we define our own balance. So for instance, I spoke to you guys about my morning routine. I get up earlier than 3 a.m., but that is also because I have clients all around the world. And so my priority is my business, is my clients. I love communicating. This morning, I was on a consultation call on Zoom at 3:30 a.m. and it's 4:30 p.m. at this point. And so this is 13 hours of Zoom consultations. Realize that what people in the general public, whether it be you see on social media or your peers, what they define as balance doesn't have to be your balance. So balance for me is living the best version of myself, is working towards being 1% better at some aspects. So that could be physically, whether it be in the gym, that could be intellectually, learning something new, that could be emotionally, that could be spiritually, my connection with God, my connection with my family. I'm trying to get 1% better in one aspect of my life each and every day. And the reason I kind of spread that out through multiple components is no journey in life is linear, meaning we're not going to get better physically every single day. We're not going to get better. We're not going to get smarter every single day. We're not going to get better emotional intelligence every single day, but we can work towards one of those aspects and really dial it in, even if it's just as simple as connecting with a friend and really reinforcing, saying something good about them or giving them a compliment, making them feel good. And really my driving force in life, and this is what balance is to me, is living, my life's passion, is giving back to others, is working with people, really helping them. And then also balancing that out with trying to not only give of myself, but also pour into my own cup. So do things that I really enjoy, I really like. So for instance, the gym is, it used to be an outlet, like a stress outlet for me, but now it's like a safe haven for me. It is the one time in my day where I turn off my phone. I carry 2 phones around me at all times. There's one day I turn off my phones. I don't answer any emails. This is a connection. This is a spiritual thing for me, essentially. And so balance to me is essentially being able to have a life where I'm feeling fulfilled. I'm working towards goals. I'm making progress in multiple areas. And I kind of consider it this I have 3 F's, and I always try to get 2 out of 3 F's. So the F's for me, my 3 F's are, fitness, there's family and faith. So my relationships with my family members, my friends, and God, and then finances. So that's also business. And I always try to get 2 out of 3, because if you think about it, like just statistically, if you're a baseball player and you hit 2 out of 3, you're a Hall of Famer. So I won't say that balance, because a lot of people will tell you, you got to do it all. You got to get all 3. Yes.
1 out of 3, you'd be a Hall of Famer of baseball.
Without a doubt. But I'm trying to, really cement my way in there. I'm trying to be like Sammy Sosa out here. Yeah. But, really when it comes down to it, I'm trying to live in alignment with my vision, with the mission that I have for myself. And that allows me to have balance. Although I will tell you that many people that know me from the outside, they only see me on social media, they don't know me personally, they think I'm unbalanced. And that's fine. We have to be accepted of that. And I always tell clients, I'm like, listen, it's the same concept. I know you guys probably have this conversation all the time, where you have a client that has stopped drinking, or they're dieting for something. And it's like, they have other people criticizing what they're doing. And I always tell my clients, listen, that is a reflection of them more than it is on you. They're really, casting their frustrations about their inability to do something on you, rather than them actually being frustrated with you. So don't take it personally. Realize that they have some inner work that they need to do. Maybe they can't, achieve the physique goals that they want, or they can't improve their health, or every time they do, they slip up and they feel frustrated that they see someone that is right in front of them, that's in their life, that's doing it and nailing it, and they feel like they're a failure as a result. And so the same thing is said about me. I don't care about any other people's definition of balance or their judgment of my level of balance, of my very early mornings, my late nights, and things like that. I'm fulfilled, and I'm doing something that I'm very blessed to be in the position I am, in terms of being able to create a career out of this. I worked a long career in a corporate industry, which I love, don't get me wrong, but this is something that I really am in alignment with, and that's my balance.
That's awesome, man.
That's awesome. Thank you.
That's awesome. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. So Brandon, why don't you tell our followers where they could find you?
Yeah, absolutely, guys. So you guys can follow me at Brandon DaCruz _, which is on Instagram. You guys will see daily content. Probably the best thing to do is, if you guys are interested in podcasts like this, look up the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. That's myself and Jeff Black. Or you can even look up my name in Spotify. You'll find like 200 plus podcasts over the years. And then also, if you guys have any questions, inquiries, things of that sort, I'm always more engaging in email, because I kind of live on my email. So feel free to reach out to me. My email address is bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And to both of you guys, it was an absolute pleasure being with you guys, spending my Friday evening with you too. And I really appreciate you guys having me on, especially as your first guest. So
man, we were blessed, man. And we're committed to bringing value, especially in the form of content. So to all of you out there, to show Brandon your appreciation, go give him a follow, share this episode with whoever you want, share it on your social media platforms, get his knowledge out there, get our knowledge out there, and try to positively impact other people. Brandon, thank you so much for our time, for your time and all of that information. And it was absolutely awesome. I'm going to put all your information in the show notes so people could go just click on it and follow you, and maybe even email you. So as you navigate your own path towards better health, just remember that balanced bodies is forever in your corner, and we will see you all next week. Brandon, thanks again.
The podcast content may include discussions of medical topics and health-related information. However, the information provided should not be considered exhaustive or complete, and it should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment.